February 1945. The black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima absorbed everything. Sound, light, the blood of men who had been fighting across it for days in conditions that made the word battlefield feel inadequate for what the island had become. The Japanese defensive network that General Tadamaki Kurabayashi had constructed across the island's 8 square miles was, by the assessment of every military engineer who studied it before and after the battle, a work of genuine genius within its own brutal terms. 17 miles of tunnels connecting hundreds of fortified positions, each one designed to survive the kind of naval and air bombardment that had reduced every previous Japanese island defense to rubble before the Marines came. Ashore, each one mutually supporting the next in a system that required the attacker to reduce positions one by one at close range rather than neutralizing them wholesale from a distance. It was a defense built for the specific conditions of Pacific Island warfare as Japan's commanders had come to understand them, built to absorb the American firepower advantage, built to force the attacker into the kind of intimate, grinding, costly fighting where spiritual determination and positional advantage might compensate for the material deficit that Japan's wartime production crisis had made impossible to close. What Kurabayashi had not fully incorporated into his defensive planning. What no Japanese commander in the Pacific War had yet encountered in sufficient scale to fully account for was the Caterpillar D-7 bulldozer, and what the D-7 could do to a defensive system built around the assumption that the terrain itself was permanent. If you're watching this for the first time, subscribe and hit the bell. These are the stories that history almost forgot, and we find them every single week. The bulldozer's appearance on Pacific Island battlefields was not, in its initial deployment, a tactical innovation. It was a logistical one, a practical response to the engineering challenges of establishing beachheads and building airfields on islands whose terrain had not been designed for the operational requirements of a 20th century military campaign. The SeaBees, the naval construction battalions whose name derived from the initial SeaBee, Construction Battalion, had been established in January 1942 as the organizational instrument through which the American military's extraordinary engineering and construction capability would be projected into the Pacific theater. They were, in their composition and their institutional culture, an expression of the same democratic and industrial depth that this channel has documented across every other dimension of American Pacific War capability. Men drawn from the civilian construction industry, from the trades and the engineering professions and the equipment operating. Specialties that American infrastructure development had produced in abundance through the pre-war decades, organized into military units and deployed with the equipment and the organizational support that the American logistical system could sustain at a scale that no other nation's military engineering establishment could approach. The D-7 bulldozer that the SeaBees brought to the Pacific was not a military vehicle in any conventional sense. It was a civilian construction machine, a product of the Caterpillar Tractor Company's manufacturing facilities in Peoria, Illinois, produced in quantities that reflected the American construction industry's pre-war demand and adapted for military use with the modifications that operational conditions required. Its tracks could cross terrain that wheeled vehicles could not negotiate. Its blade could move earth, coral, volcanic rock, and the debris of demolished structures at rates that manual labor could not approach. And in the specific tactical context of Pacific Island warfare, where Japanese defensive positions were constructed from the materials of the island itself, from coral and volcanic rock in the dense, interlocking vegetation that covered most island terrain, the D-7's ability to physically alter the landscape became, in the hands of SeaBee operators and marine combat engineers who understood its potential, something that went. Assault teams were bringing to bear. The SeaBee operators who drove D-7s in combat conditions on Iwo Jima, on Peleliu, on Okinawa, and across the island campaigns of the Pacific War's final years did so under fire, under the direct fire of Japanese defenders whose positions the bulldozer was approaching for the specific purpose of destroying the defensive advantage those positions provided. The casualty rates among SeaBee equipment operators in combat conditions reflected the genuine danger of this work. A bulldozer moving toward a Japanese defensive position was a large, slow, mechanically loud target whose approach could not be concealed and whose operator was exposed to fire from exactly the positions he was attempting to reach. The men who did this work were not infantrymen in the formal sense. They were construction workers in military uniform, equipped with the civilian skills that their pre-war lives had developed and the military training that the SeaBees organization had added to those skills, operating in conditions that the civilian construction sites where they had learned their trade had not prepared them for, and that the military training that preceded their deployment had only partially replicated. The Japanese defensive doctrine that Kurabayashi had developed for Iwo Jima and that his predecessors had employed across earlier Pacific Island campaigns had been built around a sophisticated understanding of what American weapons could and could not do against prepared defensive positions. Artillery and naval gunfire could destroy positions whose overhead cover was insufficient. Air bombardment could crater terrain and destroy surface structures. Infantry with flamethrowers and demolition charges could reduce individual positions at close range at considerable cost to the attacking force. The defense was designed to survive the first category, to limit the effectiveness of the second, and to impose maximum casualties during the third, to make every pillbox and every cave entrance a tactical problem that required the attacker to pay in lives for each individual solution, multiplied across the hundreds of positions that comprise the defensive network. What the defensive doctrine did not have an adequate answer for was the bulldozer applied not merely to the reduction of individual positions, but to the systematic alteration of the terrain on which the entire defensive network depended. Kurabayashi's tunnels and fortified positions were engineered into the specific topography of Iwo Jima's volcanic terrain, positioned to exploit fields of fire and covered approaches that the terrain's natural configuration provided and that the engineering work of his garrison had refined. When American bulldozers began systematically altering that terrain, filling depressions that provided covered approaches to American assault teams, pushing earth and volcanic rock against position openings to seal them, creating elevated platforms from which American weapons could engage positions that the original terrain had placed in defilade. They were not merely destroying individual positions. They were dismantling the geographic logic on which the entire defensive system had been constructed, one terrain feature at a time, with the patient, mechanical thoroughness of machines that did not tire and did not require the kind of individual courage that infantry assault demanded because the machine itself absorbed the risk that would otherwise have fallen on the men behind it. The specific tactical innovation that Marine combat engineers and SeaBees operators developed through the Iwo Jima and Okinawa campaigns. The coordination of bulldozer operations with infantry suppression and flamethrower teams in a combined arms sequence that addressed each element of the defensive position's capability simultaneously was documented in after-action reports that moved through the American military's institutional learning system with the speed that the Pacific War's final year permitted. The infantry suppressed the position's fire capability while the flamethrower neutralized its occupants and the bulldozer sealed the opening or collapsed the structure, producing an outcome lower than any alternative method the assault teams had developed across the preceding years of island fighting. The sequence was not invariably successful. The terrain of Iwo Jima and Okinawa presented defensive configurations that resisted even this combined approach. But as a general method, applied across the hundreds of positions that each island's defensive network comprised, it represented a genuine advance in the efficiency of a tactical problem that the Pacific Island campaigns had been generating since Tarawa. Japanese defenders who survived the experience of watching American bulldozers operate against their defensive positions described it in post-war accounts in terms that moved between the tactical and the philosophical. The tactical dimension was straightforward. The positions were being destroyed by a method that the defensive doctrine had not provided adequate countermeasures for, and that could not be effectively engaged by the weapons available to defenders whose ammunition supply was already constrained by the island's isolation from any resupply. The philosophical dimension was more complex and more revealing of what the bulldozer represented as a symbol beyond its specific mechanical function. The defensive positions that Kurabayashi's engineers had constructed into Iwo Jima's terrain had been built with the expectation that they would outlast the assault, that provided a permanence that American firepower could not overcome. The bulldozers suggested that the permanence was conditional, that the terrain itself, which had seemed the one element of the defensive equation that American industrial capacity could not simply manufacture an answer to, was subject to the same systematic revision that American engineering had applied to every other obstacle it had encountered across the Pacific. The island could be reshaped. The geology was not fixed, and the machines that were reshaping it were being operated by men who had reshaped comparable terrain in peacetime for the construction projects of a civilization whose relationship to the physical world was organized around the assumption that obstacles existed to be removed. The fuel drum that kept the D7's diesel engine running through the operational day, filled from the American logistical system's abundant fuel supply, replaced without the rationing and the calculation that Japanese fuel management required at every level of the command structure, was the same recurring symbol of productive abundance that this channel has traced across every previous episode. The bulldozer itself was in this sense the most literal possible expression of what American industrial civilization brought to the Pacific War. Not merely the weapons that fired and the ships that sailed and the aircraft that flew, but the machines that built the airfields those aircraft needed, cleared the beaches those ships deposited their troops on, and then, in the specific tactical innovation of the Pacific Island Campaign's final year, turned their construction capability against the defensive structures that Japanese engineering had built into the terrain of islands the American military had come to take. The D7 did not distinguish between building and destroying. It moved Earth in the direction it was pointed, powered by fuel that was always available, operated by men who had spent their pre-war lives learning to do exactly what the war now required them to do, for a civilization that had the organizational confidence to recognize that a construction machine was also, in the right tactical context, a weapon. By the time the American military's planning for the invasion of the Japanese home islands was underway in the summer of 1945, the SeaBees bulldozers' role in Pacific Island warfare had been so thoroughly documented and so clearly validated by operational results that it was integrated into assault planning as a standard component rather than an improvised tactical adaptation. The machines that had begun the war as logistical instruments, building the airfields and the port facilities and the roads that the American advance across the Pacific required, had become, through the empirical process, sophisticated expression on Iwo Jima had been answered, partially and at great cost, but answered nonetheless, by a machine that its designers had built to great construction sites in the American Midwest. Freedom builds things. It always has. It builds roads and airfields and the infrastructure of a civilization organized around the productive energy of its citizens. And when the war required it, it turned those same machines and those same skills and that same productive energy toward the specific problem of destroying what the enemy had built, with the patient, mechanical thoroughness of a civilization that had never learned to accept that an obstacle was permanent simply because it was made of rock. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe if you have not already. The SeaBees who drove those bulldozers under fire deserve to be remembered with the same precision as the Marines who fought beside them. We will keep finding these stories,